An extremely accomplished and talented Special Forces soldier and Vietnam vet decides to wage a one-man war on the Mafia after his family is killed. Comic book fans will certainly recognize this description as the origin of Frank Castle, the Punisher. But 5 years before the Punisher's first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 129, this same origin was also used as the plot for a book that would have arguably just as big or bigger an impact on the literary world as the Punisher did on comics. The author was Don Pendleton. The name of the character was Mac Bolan. And while the official title of the 1969 book in question was, appropriately, War Against the Mafia, it was the first in a series which would all run under the simple name, The Executioner. By the time the Executioner series ended in 2020, it consisted of 464 regular-sized novels and 178 double-sized adventures known as Super Bolans. While series creator Pendleton only penned 37 of these himself, his name would adorn every cover, even as a number of ghostwriters took over this long-running series. And, to be clear, Pendleton probably deserves that name recognition honor, as with The Executioner, he didn't just create one extremely popular action-adventure series. Because not only would the Executioner series have multiple spin-offs of its own, but its extreme success almost immediately upon a publication in the late 60s also led to a gigantic boom of similar men's adventure series. Whether you want to call them homages or, probably more accurately, rip-offs, soon the shelves of bookstores and newsstands around the world were filled with similar vigilante paperback series, such as Jacob Rosenberg's Death Merchant, Frank Scarpetta's The Marksman, R.L. Brent's The Liquidator, and Lionel Derrick's amazingly titled The Penetrator. Honestly, throughout the 70s and 80s, there were way more of these series clogging bookshelves than we have time to list here, and it didn't stop with vigilantes. The success of these series led to an overall men's adventure, pulp fiction paperback boom. This was, of course, nothing entirely new, as pulp series for men had long been a tradition in the book world, thanks to authors like Robert E. Howard, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and Mickey Spillane, whose hard-edged series starring tough PI Mike Hammer through the 50s and 60s was an obvious antecedent of the R-rated, brutal, and often sexy books that symbolized the 70s and 80s pulp paperback boom. What felt different this time was the overwhelming amount of new men's adventure series that seemed to be hitting the store shelves every month, covering a variety of genres, including post-apocalyptic sci-fi, westerns, tales of ninjas, war stories, secret agents, occult investigators, and the aforementioned vigilantes. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a used bookstore that doesn't have dozens upon dozens of these men's adventure pulp paperbacks from the 70s and 80s, still drawing the eye with their often exciting, violent, or even salacious cover art. But while some of these series, including Pendleton's The Executioner, did manage to continue on into the 90s and even the 2000s, there's no doubt the gigantic boom period of this pulp phenomenon more or less gradually petered out during the 90s, as literary trends and overall entertainment outlets evolved and changed. There are still popular Western crime and adventure series primarily aimed at male readers, but the gigantic publishing abundance of these books is a thing of the past, and the types of audacious, over-the-top stories that made up many of these series are more of a novelty today, celebrated by dedicated vintage paperback collectors and small boutique publishing labels specializing in nostalgic throwbacks. But while the days when one could easily find new copies of series such as Time Mercenaries, Cybernark, Freedom's Rangers, Rat Bastards, Chopper Ops, 357 Vigilante, Eagle Force, Ninja Master, or Super Cop Joe Blaze at their local bookstore are but a memory, a handful of the most popular pulp series of that time, those that rivaled or even eclipsed The Executioner in sales and acclaim, have held on and are still remembered in pop culture. For one of those, its continuing popularity is almost certainly helped by its brief foray into the movie world. For, even if the movie didn't go as well as planned, it's hard to forget when a new potential cinematic series is this cocky in its own title. The year is 1985, and Orion Pictures are ready to launch the next big action-adventure franchise, and James Bond competitor, as they adapt one of the most popular men's adventure pulp series of the time. With Remo Williams, the adventure begins.
Welcome once again to Failure to Franchise, the show dedicated to some of Hollywood's most infamous mistakes, missteps, and misfires. This is Trev.
And I'm Chris. Together, we're the Supremo Teamo, here to discuss if Remo's primo. We don't like making fun of actors unless they're faced yellow.
Oh, nice. Yes, before we go any further, I don't often do this, Chris, but let's put a warning on this episode. Or I should say not a warning, but maybe just like a disclaimer.
Okay.
And that is that we don't make the movies we discuss. We just talk about them. I think it's safe to say with this movie, if you and I had been in charge of this back in the 80s, we might have made some different choices about some of the elements of this film, in particular some of the casting. But we're here to talk about the movie as it was made. So strap in, bear with us on this one. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. And that is the movie that walked so Spider-Man No Way Home could run. I hope that makes sense. Remo, maybe the most hilariously titled movie we've ever done on the show, 1985's Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins. Chris, you want to tell us a little bit about good old Remo?
Of course. It is directed by Guy Hamilton. He's a Bond director, actually.
Mm-hmm.
He made Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and Man with the
one
Golden
of the big
Gun.
ones.
Oh, yeah, big time. Written by another Bond alum, Christopher Wood. He wrote Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. This is based off a book series called The Destroyer, which has over 150 novels at this time, still being written today. Warren Murphy and Richard Sapir Sapper maybe.
I would say Sapper, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. And they were the original writers of the series. Budget of the movie is $40 million, and worldwide it made $14.3 million. So gigantic bomb, and the adventure did not continue.
No.
So.
At least not in the form they were hoping for.
No,
the
not even
adventure kind of hit a dead stop right here. So this is a continuation of our Fallback to the 80s event, and for me, another movie that I definitely was just very, very familiar with from growing up with repeated cable viewings, and I think it's as we said, there's some very, very interesting things to talk about with this movie on a whole lot of different levels. But I guess we should start by let me actually just first ask you. This is another one where. Had you ever heard of this before we started talking about doing this Fallback to the 80s series? Was this a name that had ever, come across your table or anything, or no?
I recognize the poster, just from knowing, I guess, film.
Yeah.
The poster's pretty iconic, and then I'm pretty sure I had seen like the DVDs in my many retail ventures at work. So, but that was about it. I've never seen a trailer for it. Never knew what it was about, but just the iconic Statue of Liberty cover. That was really it. That was it.
Okay. Yeah, just curious. Well, as I said, I think the best way to jump into Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins, because, obviously with a title like that, it's clear what they were going for here. And the leading man, we'll talk about later, they signed him to a 3-picture deal for this. They were pretty sure this was the beginning of something. And I guess we should acknowledge, why were they that confident? What led to that? And as you alluded to, that's because this was based off of a very, very popular book series, The Destroyer, which was one of the many series that kind of existed in the 70s and 80s, like pulp men's adventure boom. You had all these different like action adventure series, many of them about Vietnam vets turned vigilantes. That was a very recurrent theme in these books. And you had series like The Executioner, The Death Merchant, my favorite named one, The Penetrator. And then there's also The Destroyer. And The Destroyer really, even though it wasn't the first one, it really rose to the top and became, I believe, the best-selling one of them all. I did some due diligence for this episode, Chris, as you know. I had never read any of these. I was familiar with the movie, but I'd never read a Destroyer novel. And I thought, if we're going to talk about this movie, I know Chris can't read, but I'll take it upon myself to read some of these so that I can discuss not just the movie as a film, but also an adaptation. So I'll talk about that a little later in the review. But I was able, thankfully, thanks to a couple of used bookstores in my area and a big used book sale I went to, I am now the proud owner of 6 of the over 150 Destroyer novels.
Oh, wow.
And for this episode, I read 3 of them, including the first one, which you would say, I guess, tangentially is the one this movie is very loosely based on. Obviously, it takes some of the origin elements. That first one is called Created the Destroyer, as you said, written by Richard Sapir and Warren Murphy. So the backstory in this book series, I'll talk about the backstory now, and I'll talk about, the ins and out of the comparison as we get into the review. But ultimately, this was Warren Murphy and Richard Sapper were two newspapermen who had actually written the first draft of Creator the Destroyer back in 1963, and nothing really happened with it. They shelved it for a while, and then there was in the late 60s and beginning 70s, there was this sudden boom, and what really started it was Don Pendleton's The Executioner series. That series started taking off, and men were buying these adventure series left and right, and they exist in all kinds of genres. There was Western ones, sci-fi ones, and then, as I said, a lot of these vigilante ones. And Sapper and Murphy suddenly realized, hey, we got one of those sitting around. And they dusted off Creator the Destroyer, sure enough got it published, and quickly started cranking out sequels, and this thing just became a gigantic phenomenon. As you said, I think it's a little slowed down today, but there are still Destroyer novels coming out periodically. It's also a character that has been adapted into comic books, so it does. We'll talk about this later, there's been other discussions about maybe trying to get the character back on the screen, but it's definitely been a huge literary phenomenon. And which is interesting because many of those pulp adventure series, I wouldn't say they're the best books in the world or anything,
right?
But they're fun. You understand.
Easy reads.
Easy reads, dude. I read each of these in one day.
Right.
Not all three in one day, but 3 days. It took me 3 days to read 3 Destroyer books.
Right.
They're very, very quick, and I have to say, after reading them, again, I'll talk more about this later, but there's certainly some very dated material in them that you get a little uncomfortable reading. But you
don't
also
say.
you also go into them kind of knowing that, and I'll admit that's. I hope people understand what I mean when I say that's a little bit of the charm, right? Because as an audience of today, you can kind of laugh at how, kind of politically incorrect these books were.
Sure.
I'm not taking them at face value anymore. Many of these vigilante Vietnam, Avenger books are very clearly right-wing leaning. America at this time was kind of in the last years of the Vietnam War and getting very, very frustrated with how it was going. I think the country in general felt very wounded coming out of the 60s and the end of the 60s with the sudden turns to violence with the Manson murders and everything. And there was just this, and crime was rampant in cities all across America, in particular New York. So you had this rise of vigilante movies because people just really were frustrated at the government and law enforcement and how things were going in Vietnam, and they wanted to believe this idea of these good, strong, heroic, noble men who would come and save them, and and that's what these books are trying to give them.
I liked how Warren Murphy and Richard Sapper both wrote each portions of their books separately. I found that interesting. They also hired a bunch of ghostwriters later on to continue the series because they kind of had falling outs, and then they reconnected and started writing again, and then somebody died, and more people took over, and it's just interesting that they've had their names on these novels since, like you said, the 70s, and it's gone through quite a bit of different visions, I guess would be correct to say. And I find that an interesting part to the character in general, right? 150 plus books with a multitude of different visions, a multitude of different writers. Obviously you only have 6 and you read 3 of them, but are they close to each other's publication dates, or are they?
No, I can tell you. I can tell you I see that vision. I think all the ones I read were by Sapper and Murphy.
Okay.
But I can tell you that even in the ones I read, you start to see the evolution of the series. So I'll tell you, I know numbers. I couldn't tell you exact. I could look it up really quickly, but publication year is not too sure about. But I read number 1 in the series, Creator the Destroyer. The next one I read was number 5, called Dr. Quake. And then I jumped ahead to number 13, Acid Rock. So obviously all the ones I read are still fairly early in the run,
Right.
But the tone, even from 1 to 13, is quite different. And I think from what I understand and from a little bit more of the research I've done, and why I'm actually excited to dive more into the series, is the tone of number 13, Acid Rock, which I'll discuss a little later, is more in line with what the series ultimately ended up being. I guess I can just say it now. A big part of what I understand of the Destroyer, and I definitely saw it in the ones I read, is it started very kind of grim and gritty, much in line with the Executioner and a lot of the other pulp men's adventure series. But at a certain point, Murphy and Sapper realized that because there were so many series like that, if they really wanted to separate theirs and be different, they decided to give it kind of a more self-parody, over-the-top sense of humor a little bit.
Right.
And it got to be very, very ridiculous in terms of the cases that Remo is sent on, the villains he's battling. And so, I think that's probably the right move, right? And the sales numbers prove it. And I also wanted to bring that up because that's another thing I'll talk about in comparison to the movie a little later, because I think But I don't know for sure. But I mean, if this started in 71 and they were coming out pretty regularly, I couldn't tell you for sure because I didn't look this up. I guess I could have. But by the time they got to the movie, this was already a series there was many, many novels of this, right?
Yeah.
And the tone had been well established and people were very familiar with this character. So we can talk later about did they make the right decisions when they brought him to the screen.
Well, and that makes perfect sense why they signed for 3 movies, right? Like they got Fred Ward to come in to play this character 3 times, only got one crack at it because again, the novels are very successful right now in 1983, 84, we'll get prepping the movie. As well, Bond is gigantic right now, right? It's in the middle of the Roger Moore era, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now, of course, Orion Pictures, which is a studio run by a bunch of execs that used to work at United Artists, which was the company at that time in charge of Bond. They decided, hey, we have these great novels that people are that have.
They all remembered those like champagne orgies they got to go to when the Bond film hit,
Totally.
Remember the days? How do we get back to that?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. So then that's why they reach out to Guy Hamilton and Christopher Ward, or Christopher Wood, sorry. And they just need to recreate that, right?
Yeah.
And so it makes sense why they wanted to make an American version of Bond. That's kind of where this is all coming from. They
even call it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, they call it a red, white, and blue collared Bond, which I loved. That's a great way of saying it.
Yeah, that actually should have been on the poster. In fact,
100%.
Yeah.
So it should have been a surefire hit.
Yeah, because this is like one of those guns where honestly, I don't blame them. I would have made that bet too. Like given how big these books were at the time, and as you said, the Bond series being very big, and just this idea of we've got this, interestingly named. We've talked about some of the movies we've looked at before. We thought the names were bad. And this is actually a case where I would say Remo Williams is a pretty awesome name.
Right.
And maybe that actually is better than just the Destroyer, which is like kind of generic sounding. So maybe that like name change wasn't the worst idea in the world. The cockiness of The Adventure Begins, that's a little different.
Yeah.
But yeah.
You really are setting yourself up for disaster with that.
Yeah. You got to be careful. Like whenever you make a movie, you can't have a name that like insinuates sequels to come. And you should never have a name that can be turned into like some kind of pun in bad reviews, right?
100%.
You don't want to call your movie like something like Sucks or something, because people are just gonna be like, yep, it sure does. You have to be careful of things like that. But yeah, I would have made that bet for sure. I would have thought this would have been a hit if I was working at that studio as well.
And right now they need a leading man they need their Bond, right? And do they go for the incredible good looks of a man that is just the definition of model quality, debonair suit and tie? No, not at all. They go for Fred Ward, who is not, not to say not a good-looking man, which he was, but just he's not polished. He's chiseled. He looks like, they quoted saying like he has a face of a boxer. Like he looks like a rough and tumble blue collar guy, and it makes for a unique casting decision. Because at this time in the 80s, they were run amok of action heroes that looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, muscle-bound, greasy, big muscle. You know what I mean? And lots of violence. And here, this is pre-Die Hard, right? And that's a Bruce Willis was actually in talks to be into this in this movie pre-Die Hard.
Yep.
And this is kind of Die Hard before Die Hard in a weird way. Like, it's a New York cop, and he's kind of a bruiser, and then there's like Karate Kid came out a year before, right? So they're trying to add that in there too. So it's kind of like Karate Kid meets Die Hard in a lot of ways.
A lot of people at the time called this this is clearly a Karate Kid ripoff. This is trying to be like an adult Karate Kid. I watched the Siskel and Ebert review for this movie yesterday.
Okay.
And Siskel made that comparison. He said he was like, this is Siskel who enjoyed it, by the way. Thumbs up from Siskel, thumbs down from Ebert, in case you're wondering. But Siskel did say he felt like it was kind of an adult Karate Kid. And it's funny just because I think the filmmakers are kind of put in a position to have to defend that, be like, but these characters have been in these books since '71.
Sure.
We're not copying Karate Kid, but you still could see. That probably didn't hurt the chances of it being made into a movie. when you have this idea of, an Asian mentor, doing martial arts training for your hero. But I like what you said about Fred Ward being different than the other action heroes of the 80s, because that's definitely true. He's very much a throwback more to the action heroes of the 70s, right?
Yeah.
That was kind of like the calculated movie they're making. He's more in the spirit of a Clint Eastwood, a Charles Bronson, a Steve McQueen, a Lee Marvin. That's the kind of vibe Fred Ward has. And you mentioned he has the face of a boxer. Well, that's not surprising because he was a boxer.
Yeah.
Fred Ward, one of these guys who you look at his life and you just start to think to yourself, oh my God, I've worked like in retail all my life, I've gone to school for like English, I am not half the man like Fred Ward was before he even became like a rough and tumble actor. So just to kind of quickly talk about his background. So before he was an actor, he did spend 3 years in the Air Force. He was also a boxer, and he did break his nose 3 times, which kind of lends to the interesting face he ended up having. He worked as a lumberjack in Alaska. He was also a janitor and a short order cook. And then, interestingly enough, he starts to study acting at New York's Herbert Berghoff Studio. And for a while, he kind of gets involved in kind of like experimental theater and stuff like that. And I always think it's interesting whenever you hear about these actors who you would just assume. If I had to guess, I would have thought they just found Fred Ward working on a construction site or something, right?
Totally.
And we're like, "Do you want to be an actor?" He's like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" He takes the cigar out of his mouth. He's like, "I'll give that a try," But then you find out he was actually working what would probably be really pretentious New York experimental theater. I always find that really interesting because I think it says something interesting. It's really compelling about their actual dedication to the craft. This is a guy who actually did care very deeply about acting, and maybe got the career he had because of his looks. But maybe it's interesting to wonder if that was the career he wanted, if he just went along with it, if he understood how he looked and rode that wave. But I want to talk a little bit about his career up to this point. But first I want to ask you general thoughts on Fred Ward, because I'm guessing your main Fred Ward association is also my main Fred Ward association.
Yes, it is.
So let's talk about that and also just what we think of Fred Ward in general.
Yeah, and what we're alluding to is the movie Tremors.
Yes.
Tremors is like a horror masterpiece.
5-star movie for me.
Yeah, I have always loved that movie. I saw it very young, probably a lot younger than I should have. It only came out 2 years. Well, yeah, 2 years after I was born, but I saw it very, very young, and I loved it. It's scary, it's fun, it's silly, the practical effects are amazing, and it's held together by Fred Ward and Kevin Bacon. And they're just like a perfect two-hander, 2 co-leads, right? And Fred Ward always will have a place in my heart because of Tremors. I haven't seen the sequels, to be honest, or at least never in a sit down from start to finish situation. Definitely parts of it because they used to air on cable all the time. But yeah, no, Fred Ward is always a face that pops up that I am excited to see.
Yes.
When he does. Again, his name is rarely on the poster. You know what I mean? I'm looking at the Tremors poster right now, and on the very top it says Kevin Bacon. And he had it, like you said, an interesting career, but you can tell that he cared about the craft, and he's just always good in the role that he's in, regardless of how small or how large it was. And unfortunately, we lost Fred Ward this year, just a few months ago, actually. Quite young too, right? Wasn't he or
just like 79 or something.
Oh, 79. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
But just, in general, I am a big fan of him when I see him. Right? He's a tough actor to crack in that sense because he's not Kevin Bacon, right? So
no, but he definitely falls into when he passed away. It was pretty depressing because it's like we're losing this last part of this last generation, right, of a particular kind of actor.
Totally.
I put him in the same camp as a Robert Forster, right? Just these these regular Joe actors who can play blue collar and just but are also just fantastic actors who can be very, very sensitive on screen, but also tough, and can fit into just a variety of roles. And I would just kind of go back to the Tremors thing for a moment. He's awesome in that. If you haven't seen the sequels, I would definitely recommend at least checking out Tremors 2, which is the one that's the one where he finally gets, I believe, his name on the poster, because it's he came back for Tremors 2 and Kevin Bacon did not. And it's the final Tremors movie that it still focuses on his character. Michael Gross's Burt Gummer shows up about halfway through, and it becomes, about the two of them again as buddies. And after that point, Tremors becomes like the Burt Gummer series. Michael Gross becomes the face of Tremors. But it's kind of cool that Fred Ward at least got one more starring role. And that really is, Tremors 2, I think, is a really, really fun sequel. Like, it's obviously not Tremors.
Yeah.
But for a straight-to-video sequel, which at that time, too, I want to say maybe Tremors 2 is the first ever straight-to-video sequel I saw in my life. Because I remember just thinking, like, when it came out, like, well, that's weird. I don't remember seeing that in theater. Oh, it didn't go to theaters? Like, even the idea of, like, a straight-to-video sequel was new at the time, But they do a really fun job with that movie. And it's cool to see him get the entire kind of spotlight. No offense to Kevin Bacon, who also rules in that movie.
Of course.
But, yeah, it's nice to see, Fred Ward get the spotlight.
You know who I feel is like a modern-day Fred Ward?
Well, are you going to talk about his clone?
Yes. And it's the first time I've really realized this, especially watching this movie because they're similar age at this point, in this film. But John Bernthal,
yes,
you said clone. That's what it is. I was going to say related, but you're right. They're clones. It's crazy watching Remo Williams, and I was like, holy shit, like that's John Bernthal to a T.
And John Bernthal, like, is so fits into what we were just saying too.
Yeah.
Like John Bernthal, you look at him and obviously he's the Punisher, right?
Yeah.
Obviously he's Shane from Walking Dead. He is this like really tough looking masculine man. And then you watch interviews with him and he's like one of the most sensitive people. He's so in tune with like the acting craft. He just seems like such an amazing person. And it's like, oh yeah, like he's got that same even vibe to him. And yeah,
Totally.
It seems like he's keeping that spirit alive of like that kind of actor.
Yeah, 100%.
I think what's interesting about Fred Ward and this film and him getting cast in this role is that I was looking through his filmography, and like you, I love Fred Ward. There's a lot of things I know him from, but they're usually smaller parts. But I was trying to like track his career, right? And I was thinking like, well, what was Tremors for him? Was that like a continuation of an already, pretty strong career? And I'd say actually no, Tremors was like a little bit of a comeback almost, except not even, right? Like Tremors is a hit, but he doesn't really spin out of it in like a big way. It really seems like the bombing of Remo Williams really was a huge like detriment to his career.
Yeah.
Because I was looking at like what he'd done up to that point, and he kind of comes onto the movie scene, in '79. Speaking of Clint Eastwood, as one of the other inmates in Escape from Alcatraz, the fantastic Prison Break movie based on the true story with Clint Eastwood. He's really good in that. Awesome movie. A couple other small roles and some other things, but then notably into the '80s, he starts doing really well. In '81, he is one of the National Guardsmen who end up battling not evil, but like vindictive Cajuns in Walter Hill's Southern Comfort, a movie I mentioned in our last episode when we looked at Streets of Fire.
Oh, cool.
In 1982, he has his first lead role in a sci-fi adventure movie called Time Rider: The Adventure of Lyle Swan. Not a movie I've ever heard of, but now I'm interested in it. Where he plays a motocross racer who somehow time travels back to 1877. So that sounds fun. I want to check that out.
That's cool.
He has a great 1983 though. He is a supporting character in Silkwood, the very prestigious drama with Meryl Streep. He is then a supporting character also in Uncommon Valor, a Vietnam action movie with Gene Hackman and Patrick Swayze. That was like a huge surprise hit that year. It was like one of the biggest movies of the year, which nobody really expected. And then he also plays Gus Grissom in The Right Stuff, the very successful epic movie about the American space program. So just a fantastic 1983. So the fact that he's coming off that year, then you can really understand why they were kind of locked into him for this, right? Because he's a star on the rise. And then I did notice that after Remo Williams, that's never quite the case again, right? He suddenly starts being in really, really small roles after that in different things. Never really has too many more leading roles. And like I said, with Tremors, he gets a lead role, but he's not able to capitalize on it in as big of a way as you would hope. And maybe that's just because his kind of character actor and his kind of star was going out of style a little bit.
It's frustrating when such talent gets put in movie jail. And not to say that he wasn't working. He was working every single year, basically, right? Like, and he believe me, Fred Ward did well, right? But he's kind of one of those, like you're saying, a character actor that had his moment to shine, and then the movie tanks and critically panned, and then he can never get back to the poster again, right? And it's a shame that Hollywood does that. It's a thing that happens again and again. And this is a good one of the good ones. You know what I mean? Like this is like and to be fucked over by people not showing up for this movie. And we're going to talk about what we feel about the movie and if we agreed or not with the critical malignment. But yeah, and there is a lot to discuss why people may not have come back for Remo Williams.
Yeah, well, maybe some of that actually even wasn't as big of a concern at the time, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, before we get into that, I just wanted to mention, just to stay on the Fred Ward thing for just another second here, I am happy for him that even though his career never quite recovers from Remo Williams, as we said, he was able to still carve out a really productive career as a character actor, and he has a lot of small roles and like a lot of great stuff. I think he was really adept at comedy, actually. I love him as the villain in Naked Gun 33 1/3. And then it's a very small role, but I think he's very, very funny as Joe Dirt's dad.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You're right. I forgot about that.
Yeah. And then the Fred Ward movie that I think is like really underrated and underseen that I would point everyone towards is a 1991 TV movie. It was actually made for HBO called Cast a Deadly Spell, which is a 50s noir detective movie, but in a world where magic exists. And he plays Detective Harry Philip Lovecraft. Haha, not very subtle there. But he plays a detective who takes cases like in the magic world, and so has to fight like monsters and vampires. But it's got all like the tropes of an old film noir with that hard boiled, voiceover and everything. And he's really awesome in that.
Well, now that they have their leading man for Remo Williams, they need their Mr. Miyagi for the other co-lead, right? The Korean master of martial arts to train Remo Williams. And producer Larry Spiegel said it best in casting this. He says, "We assumed, of course, that we would be using an Oriental actor. We couldn't find one, and then I thought of Joel Grey."
Yeah. We'll talk about that soon. So maybe it's just time to get into it. Maybe let's you want to talk about the movie?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, let's do it.
America's top security experts have chosen this man.
Don't take any chances. This guy's a killer.
For a special mission. But first, he's got to pass one little test.
Speak English.
Does your nightingale sing?
Hold it!
You move like a baboon with two club feet. However, I think I can do something with him.
Goodbye, Mr. Crow.
Who's he?
No more Boy Scouts. Take a look at this. High-altitude reconnaissance probe.
Yes, we make that.
There is none. Doesn't exist.
These men will rob America of her might.
He won't be with us for much longer.
Unless someone
Relax.
can stop them.
Concentrate. This is not time for prayer.
Remo Williams. The adventure begins.
What are you watching?
Your country's one contribution to the art.
It's a soap opera.
It is apparent to me that you know less than nothing. Place your hands behind your head. I did not say keep them there.
Before he's through, he'll learn to move faster than a bullet.
Excellent.
Not bad, huh?
Hear the heartbeat of an enemy.
John, I need to borrow him for a while.
And leave no footprints in the sand.
Some joker walks into one of my plants, snoops around, walks right out again, and now you're telling me he doesn't exist.
Across town, a man has found his head blown off.
Perfect accident.
And you telling me he's gonna get away with it, huh? And we can't stop him?
You can stop him, son.
It'll be my pleasure.
Now, based on the Destroyer novel series that sold over 30 million copies, America's favorite tough guy comes to the screen. In a movie big enough to hold him. Remo Williams. The adventure begins.
After a violent night and being pronounced dead, a New York cop wakes up with a new face and a new name, Remo Williams. He finds himself under the employ of a secret unit of the government called CURE, which was set up to investigate a dangerous industrialist whose organization has secured several government arms contracts, including a top-secret strategic defense system. With training of mystical Korean martial arts by Master Chiun, Remo Williams will become an unstoppable, bullet-dodging, wet cement-running, rice-eating action hero.
Yes, that is indeed Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins. Chris, this is a movie I had seen before in my youth. This was a return for me, but this is a first-time watch for you. I'm very interested to hear first how you felt about visiting this character now in this world and some of the choices they made.
Yeah, like I said, I no recollection of what this movie is. No idea. I did watch the trailer before, and I did my research before the movie, so I knew what I was getting into for the most part, right? First and foremost, I don't think any movie from the 80s should be 2 hours long. That's a long time. And I think that this movie suffers from that. Maybe not the most, but a lot of it is that this movie is very long. It feels long. It's quite boring, in my opinion, a lot of the time. And there's two plot lines that are happening simultaneously of Remo being trained by, Master Chiun, and then the villain's plot. And they're happening parallel, but rarely crossing paths. And I think it doesn't happen till really like the end. And it just seems to drag. Now, on top of that, let's just talk about it now. I'm going to say my feelings, of course, but then we'll actually discuss it, in full. But like we just alluded to, Master Chiun is played by a white man that is under a ton of prosthetics and makeup, and he's doing the most stereotypical Asian accent. And it's weird because at the time, this movie actually won the Oscar for Best Makeup.
No, it was nominated.
Sorry, it was nominated. That's what it was. It was nominated for Best Makeup, which is very weird. And then he was also Joel Grey was nominated for a Golden Globe for his performance.
He won the Golden Globe.
Oh, so I switched those up. Okay, that's what it was. Yeah. He won. Yeah, okay. And I am not prone to being affected by problematic things in movies. They don't typically bug me. I recognize them, but I don't usually need to go onto HuffPost and write a whole fucking diatribe and try to cancel it, right? I think we learn from the past. I think to learn new things in the future, we don't have to cancel and destroy history, especially in film and art, right? We learn from it. But this was very, very uncomfortable for me. And Trev knows me, and I don't usually get that uncomfortable. So all the humor and character stuff and their relationship together, which is the crux of the film, it lives and dies on this relationship of Chiun and Remo Williams, and it is just very troubling. To put it lightly. Like I was very, very uncomfortable. It reminds me of a movie that I love a lot, though. I love the movie Short Circuit. Okay.
I was going to bring that up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and Fisher Stevens is doing brownface in that movie, and I actually didn't know that when I was a kid. Right when I watched that movie, I didn't see anything, and of course I got older and I realized, holy shit, like that was a white guy the whole time. Now the difference between this movie and that movie, though, of course that was bad. I'm not saying that was good. I'm saying that's bad. And remember, when we said in the beginning, we don't make these movies. We're just commenting on them. But there's something about this. There was a guy sitting in a chair for 5 hours thinking, what the fuck am I doing? And nobody in the production, nobody in the day one of filming, nobody seeing the dailies just stopped for a moment and looked at each other and go, maybe we shouldn't do this. It's very much Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, And I just kept thinking the whole time, Your production was so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. And that is my feelings on the movie, which we will discuss in full. So go ahead, your turn.
All right, Chris, do you have your phone by you?
I do, yes.
All right, I'm sending you something right now.
Okay.
And then I want you to tell the listeners what I sent you.
You son of a bitch. This is hilarious. Okay, listeners, we
Let me
did
give a backstory here.
Yeah, we did a series of an event that we were leading up to the Dark Universe stuff, right, with the Mummy and Tom Cruise. So like, go listen to those episodes. But we did a bunch of movies, and we started off with Van Helsing, and I surprised Trev on the podcast of the Van Helsing episode that I actually own Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman, and I like it, right? And Trevor was he was appalled. He threatened to stop the podcast and block me.
And you sent me a picture of you with your Van Helsing DVD.
Yes, giving a thumbs up. Well, I just received a side-by-side of that picture and Trev mimicking me, holding his DVD copy of Remo Williams. The Adventure Begins with a thumbs up. That is absolutely hilarious.
So yes, this is a movie I've owned on DVD for quite some time.
Of course.
Now let me get into my thoughts and let me explain. All right.
Okay. Yeah. Of course.
So it's a movie I grew up with, right? It's a movie I remember seeing quite a bit on TV as a kid and enjoying, thinking it was pretty fun. And then, I don't even remember when I got this DVD. I'm pretty sure I either got this DVD for free from a friend who was getting rid of some old DVDs, or I bought it at like a used video store,
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly was like, yeah, I'll take Remo Williams. I remember liking that movie. But I'm not sure I'd ever put this DVD in until it came time for this episode, right? Which is when I then discovered this is even this film has been formatted to fit your TV DVD. I was like,
that's
no.
good.
Yeah. So now revisiting it with the eyes of an adult, which for probably the first time, because I'm sure it's been over 20 years since I've watched Remo Williams.
Right.
Obviously, my thoughts are a little different, but I'll say this: I'm not as negative as you are. I think this movie is kind of fun, and I'll talk about what I like about it as we go in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're very right about some of your criticisms. And in fact, I think 3 criticisms for me are what ultimately keep it from being as good as I remembered it to be or as I wanted it to be.
Right.
And I'll talk about those 3. So one of them is obviously the Joel Grey issue. And only to the point where, so you were mentioning how, it was so distracting to you. And that's kind of how I feel, because this is going to sound so horrible, but I hope people understand, because it comes from a different time, and because I think it's interesting to look back on those films.
Yeah.
And I try not to obviously you can say, ooh, that was a bad decision, but you try not to entirely throw the movie out because of that. And, this is coming off of a long history of, characters particularly Fu Manchu, who've been played by, Boris Karloff and Christopher Lee. It was kind of the standard at the time. If you had these kind of stereotypical Asian mentor characters, to get a white actor to play them, and to see can we do an impressive makeup job? A character like Charlie Chan and the old detective series of in the 40s and 50s was same thing. You mentioned Fisher Stevens. I was going to bring that up. The 80s was still kind of doing this.
Yeah.
And so I have to look at it and go, okay, well, let me try this. This is really unfortunate. I wish they hadn't done it. So in that regard, it's not even that I watch the movie and get angry at the movie. It is more that it's distracting the whole time.
Yes, that's
because
totally
you're always thinking about it.
Yep.
That's the only thing. Is it's not even so much that it's ugh, it's more just the whole time you're well, that's an odd decision. That's a strange thing to have done.
Yeah.
Because I'll actually say so that's one of my big problems. But I will say, just to get to my point here, I'll say the irony of that is that where I slightly disagree with you, I think the ultimate irony of this film is, though, even though casting Joel Grey is clearly a misguided decision, I actually do think the chemistry between Fred Ward and Joel Grey and their stuff together is the best stuff in the movie.
Right.
I think Remo and Chun together are actually very fun. And I think the movie's best sequences are the training sequences. Mm-hmm. But that alludes to my second problem, and that is agreeing with you that the movie is too long, and in particular that it's entirely front-loaded. Now, maybe my favorite moment in the movie is in the second half, which is a very funny sequence with a very interesting way to break out of a room, which I'm sure we'll talk about. That part's great. But other than that, everything awesome about this movie is in the first half. It's the entire, Remo Williams waking up and getting recruited into Cure, meeting Chun, getting trained by Chun, and culminating in like the centerpiece of the movie, which is this like great action sequence on the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of like all downhill after that. And the problem is there's still like another hour. So if this movie had been an hour and a half, and we had weeded that last hour down to just half an hour, I think we'd have something much stronger here. So those are my first two problems: Joel Grey's casting being distracting and too long. And then for me, honestly, the biggest problem, I think, if you want to make a movie in 1985 and you want it to be a modern Bond movie, you better find a villain worthy of a Bond villain. And the villain in this movie sucks.
Bad.
Like,
terrible.
I don't care about a guy who's bad because he made bad weapons, but he like conned the government into giving him contracts. What? Who gives a shit? Like that's like it's so lame. Like he's not memorable. He, like you said, he barely has any interactions with Williams until the very end, so you don't really care about their final face off. Just a really weird decision. And the reason I think it's doubly weird is, Chris, but this is why I mentioned before that by the time they made this movie, the book series must have been pretty far along. And I want to read you an abridged list of some of the villains who Remo Williams had faced in the books by this time. All right?
Okay.
There's Mr. Gordon's, a shape-shifting NASA-created android with limited emotional capabilities. There's cartoonist Uncle Sam Beasley, revived from cryogenic sleep and armed with an animatronic eye and hand. There's the super soldier Eliza Root, a cyborg with electricity-based superpowers. There's the Master, a Chinese vampire. There's Rasputin himself, an undead Russian monk. And there's the Krashiva, a Russian soldier with the ability to walk through walls and transmit his physical form by converting into energy and traveling on phone lines. So
You've made me very angry.
So you have all those villains to work with.
Yeah.
And you go, let's do a crooked arms dealer. It's such a weird decision, and it's like that. I think really sinks the movie in an unfortunate way.
100%. Like again, I was focusing on the yellow face there for a bit for sure, and we're gonna keep talking about it. But I just kept thinking that if this movie was meant to be a Bond ripoff. Like, let's just say that's what it was. It was it was developed and built and designed to just be a Bond ripoff. Well, if you're going to do that, why are there no gadgets? There's no hot chicks. There's no espionage. Like, there's no... Like, why doesn't he order a Budweiser instead of a martini? Like, just fucking copy the movie. You know? And that's the strange part. And that you just mentioned about... One of the best parts of the movie is kind of a henchman who we call them Diamond Tooth, I think, and he's
Stone is his name, but
yeah, but he has a diamond on his tooth, and Remo basically pushes his head onto glass and makes his tooth cut the glass so he can shatter it, and that part is great. And I was sitting there being like, that's the only Bond moment.
Yeah.
In this entire Bond ripoff. So I think developing it as one thing and then completely whiffing on that is so strange to me. Just copy it. You know, I would have liked it more if it was just a fucking ripoff. Hey listeners, it's Chris here. Just dropping in because me and Trev, after we had recorded the podcast, we of course talked about the movie more and whatnot. And then the following day we were texting and we realized we didn't really speak on why we think Guy Hamilton might have been, I don't want to say the root cause of why the movie didn't connect with audiences and or fans of the Destroyer books. But we thought it was important to drop in here and say that perhaps the problem was that they wanted to create a new Bond type series, right? But they didn't exactly realize the Remo books were popular because the character himself was sort of an anti-Bond figure in terms of personality and background. You know, again, blue-collar Bond versus white-collar, jeans versus tuxedo, rugged face versus traditionally handsome. And I think maybe the producers understood that. But Guy Hamilton didn't, and seems to have wanted to make a movie that was closer to, the goofy Roger Moore era Bond films because of their success. So, you can't blame him. But this property perhaps needed to be more extreme, perhaps even R-rated, to capture the vibe of the books and please those Destroyer book fans. It comes down to distinguishing themselves more than the actual Bond films. Because as I just said, this movie wants to be a ripoff, but does it poorly. So that's a main criticism to the film itself. It just doesn't stand on its own and really lives in limbo land between both those properties. So anyways, we just wanted to add this in because we felt it was important. Back to the show. Right?
Yeah, and I think the sense of humor is there more in like the interplay between him and Chun, like I said. Like I do think like so we're not gonna keep dancing around the yellow face. Like obviously it's unfortunate. Obviously, like you would never make that decision today. And honestly, reading the books, I have to acknowledge this is what I said what I meant when I said the books are very dated. I'd be very intrigued to read some of the more recent Destroyer books and see how they deal with this, because ultimately Chun is very much a very stereotypical, mystical Asian mentor character, right? And so they're getting the character right on the screen to the degree he was in the books. And if you can set aside the awfulness of that casting, which you shouldn't, but just to bear with me for a second, Joel Grey is giving a good performance, right? He is putting his all into it, and I think he is actually pretty funny as the character. Are there probably also many Asian actors who could have also done that? Yes, of course. And that's maybe they were worried about asking an Asian actor to play such a stereotypical character. I doubt it. I doubt that ever entered their mind. But I was thinking of, why couldn't this have been James Hong? Totally. James Hong as Chun would have been perfect. And so, yeah, even though I like the interactions between Remo and Chun, and I think it's the best stuff in the movie, you're still just always like, you always feel bad about liking it. Anytime I laughed at something, I was like, oh, that is funny, but, ooh,
Yeah, and I'm like, it was so hard to listen to him, I'm not going to perform the accent, but it's a lot of L's and R's, it's exactly what you think it will be. And it just makes it uncomfortable. That's the word I kept using. Like I kept saying to myself, I'm like, this is uncomfortable. I recognize that this has got some charm to it. I'm recognizing it. But like you just said, you kind of debate with yourself and you're debating your own enjoyment, being like, I should turn this off. like it's so misguided. And I just kept thinking about Fred Ward, mostly, actually, because Joel Grey signed up for it. He's quoted saying stuff like, I wasn't sure about taking the role because I didn't think I was the right kind of actor for it. And I'm like, no shit, bro. Like of course you weren't. You didn't have to do it. But Fred Ward acting against this guy, this one shows you how good of an actor Fred Ward is. Because he sells the idea that this bond, pun unintended, but this bond between them grows into more of a friendship, right? And he sells it, and he goes to work every day watching this guy doing yellowface right to his face.
Yeah. And
that, I just kept thinking, I was like, man, what is Fred Ward thinking when he goes home?
And this is where I say, the sad thing is, like, you have to admit to yourself, like, probably nothing. Like, I hate to throw Fred Ward under a bus, but I'm just thinking of like the time, right? Like,
I guess so. Yeah,
it took a long time for Hollywood to realize this isn't the way to do it. Like this was still kind of somewhat standard practice, right? And like maybe their defense is ultimately like, hey, it's not like as bad as Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. Like maybe that's their ultimate like, there's some, at least this is like a respectful character in that he's the hero of the film or one of the heroes of the film. But yeah, I don't know. It's just strange, and like to especially think of the fact that, because you said it's like odd that it got nominated for best makeup. I don't know. Like this is a complicated thing too, where they should have never done that makeup job, but it actually is a very, very impressive makeup job.
For sure.
Like,
No, I agree. It's impressive.
I get why it was nominated, because they did a great job of it. And then, like I said, I kind of get why like Joel Grey would even get nominated for acting awards for it, you know. And Joel Grey is an awesome actor, you know. Obviously great in Cabaret. You and I, of course, remember him as Doc in Buffy season 5. A very, very creepy, scary character. He's just great. Like everything he pops up in. He's the dad of Jennifer Grey. Got to give him credit for that, you know. So I like Joel Grey. What do you say? I don't know. It's like this is a difficult one to talk about, because like there's other things I want to talk about, but that's always going to be the albatross that like hangs over this movie, unfortunately.
Well, like that's the thing. Like I want to talk about specifics even with the plot and stuff, but it just I kept coming back to the biggest reason why this movie is not good, and I can't in any good consciousness like recommend it. You know what I mean? And it's like I want to talk about how in the very beginning of this movie, Remo Williams is a cop. He has a different name at this point. I can't remember what it is. Sam, maybe. And he gets in a fight, and then he gets pushed off into the water, and he wakes up, and apparently he has a different face now, even though his face kind of looked the same before. It doesn't matter. It's all good. Yeah. He just has no mustache now. Yeah. And this guy, basically, this organization fakes his death and then recruits him to like a two-man operation. That's the secret thing called Cure. But Remo has no questions. He doesn't seem to care about his past life. What about his family, his friends, his mortgage, his goldfish? Like, he doesn't seem to give a shit. And if you're going to fake a death of somebody and completely change him and give him a new name, a new face, and now he's a secret private or a secret government assassin, I want to see Remo Williams maybe deal with the repercussions of that. And I know that's maybe a different movie, but that's a more interesting movie.
Well,
and that's it becomes too quote unquote humorous for its own good. It's not even like really good humor. Like, you know what I'm trying to say?
No,
like,
and that's why. See, this is. I'm so glad I read the first book, so that you and I can actually attack this on two different levels.
Okay.
Because you get to just approach this as just a going in cold moviegoer, and like what works about this and what doesn't work. And now I can talk to you about its strengths and more specifically its weaknesses as an adaptation. So I'm really happy that I read book number 1, Created the Destroyer, because that's the book that has the entire Remo Williams origin story.
right.
And I will say that everything you just talked about is handled so much better in that book. And it just feels like this movie is really trying to rush through all that. Whereas the book obviously can take its time and really develop that. And they also make some weird changes in the movie that I don't understand. So first of all, in the book, his name is already Remo Williams. He's a police officer named Remo Williams. I don't know why they added this whole thing with him having another name. And like, because it's like if they fake his death, he can still use his name. Who cares, right?
Yeah, totally.
But the book does it a completely different way, where the book opens with him on death row, because it turns out he has been framed. Somebody made it look like he killed a drug pusher, even though he didn't. And so he's been sent to death row, and Cure sends in, the character we meet in this movie, McCleary, his kind of, his main contact. McCleary comes to him posing as a priest, give him his last rites before he goes to the electric chair, and says, "Do you want to live?" And Remo's like, "Well, of course I do." He's like, "Well, here, take this pill, and right when they strap you in an electric chair, bite down on it. And what it'll do is it'll electrocute you, but it won't kill you, but you'll seem dead, and then we'll claim your body." They tell them, like, we need to take his body because he's so psychotic, we want to do like an experiment on his brain. And the prison just goes, "Oh, okay," And then they give him the body, and then they wake him up, and then they explain to him everything about how, like, we've erased all your records. You are now going to be an agent for us for Cure. But they also go into a backstory where you find out that McCleary had originally met Remo Williams back in Vietnam. Remo Williams was a Vietnam soldier who was known for he single-handedly went into a village to rescue these kidnapped soldiers and just like took out the whole village himself. And McCleary always remembered that and always said, like, I remember that guy. Like, and then so when he works for Cure and they say we need someone to be the destroyer, he's like, I know a guy. He's a cop now in New York. Let's get him. And they go out of their way to tell you about how Remo Williams has no connections. That's why he's like perfect for them, right? He has no family, he has no friends, but still he there are a lot of the first book is dedicated to him being like not knowing exactly what he's gotten into and having questions about it and begrudgingly getting into this first case, and like throughout the whole first book thinking to himself, all right, I'll do this first mission they send me on, and then I'm going to take the money they gave me and run, and they're never going to find me. And then during the course of the book he realizes that oh, you know what? They've given me a license to kill, right? Like they're giving me money to do these cases. I'm learning these awesome martial arts. Maybe I kind of like this gig. You know, I was not much was going for me as a cop in New York. Maybe this is a little bit better. So basically everything is handled better. So
Yeah.
the movie like really shortchanges all that to play it too light. And that's the other point I wanted to make is that even though the series eventually does go into like parody, as I mentioned, the first book really is kind of this like intense crime story, and ultimately you also get a lot more backstory on Cure as an agency, because yes, the main Cure agents are only the director Harold W. Smith, Remo, Chion, and McCleary, but you find out that there's like tons of people that work for Cure and don't realize they work for Cure, because the way they set it up is they have all these people doing like analytical work on different things. They think they're working for the IRS, or they think they're working for like the CIA, but really they work for Cure and don't even realize it. And Cure only answers to like the president. So you get like all this like additional backstory, and that's not here either. No. And they're initially the first few books are all about they've been created basically to take out the mafia. And so you're putting like Remo up against these like, you know, these mafia lords and everything. And it's just like, it's like this down and gritty crime thing. So you either could have done that, right? The movie probably would have been better served to be more dark and serious. Or if you wanted it to be funny, which clearly they do, then you needed to be as ridiculous as I mentioned earlier.
100%.
Then you needed the androids or the Russian super soldiers who can walk through walls. Instead, they pick like the most bland middle.
Yeah, and that's why the movie's just so medium. Like it's just so it's painfully medium. Yeah. And it's kind of one of those movies that we have sometimes a hard time talking about because it's too low or too high in either direction, right? Like it's just there. It just exists. This movie just exists. And if it wasn't for the yellow face, there'd really not much to talk about. You know what I mean? Like even Cure itself is two guys in a room basically the whole time. Wilford Brimley plays the director, and I do like the idea that he probably signed on, was like, do I never have to stand up?
I have that in my notes. That's an entirely sitting performance from Wilford Brimley.
Yeah, he like barely even moves in his chair. I think he turns around a couple times. But it's just, I don't know what this organization is. I'm also, I don't exactly believe him when they're, you know what I mean? Like,
and even that, like the relationship between Harold Smith and Remo in the books is always like Remo like loves busting his balls. Like every time Smith calls him and gives him a mission, like Remo is just like so mean to him, and they just put up with him because he's the destroyer, right? He's the guy they picked, and he's like the best one for the job. Right. And then, but here it's just like he has like no interplay with Wilford Brimley. They have no chemistry together. No, right? There's nothing there, and that's like so unfortunate. Can I read you I want to read you a segment of the first book, which kind of speaks to this, right? Sure. So I want you to hear some of this. And they did pull a little bit of this dialogue, and you'll hear it when you'll recognize when you hear it. They pulled a little bit of this out and put it into the movie, but not delivered in the same like way. And it's just so quick. And again, the movie just kind of falls on its face when it tries to adapt things. Okay. But this is McCleary telling Remo about Cure and about what his life is going to be like now as an agent, right? And I want you to compare this to like the movie we got. I can't tell you who runs it from the top, McCleary said, but I'm your boss. You won't be able to have a real love life, but there will be plenty of women at your disposal. Money? No question. Only one danger. If you get in a spot where you may talk, then it's chips out of the game. But if you watch yourself, there should be no trouble. I've got to warn you, this is a dirty, rotten job. The real danger is that the work will kill you inside. None of us have to worry about retirement because, okay, I'll level with you, none of us is going to live that long. I promise you terror for breakfast, pressure for lunch, tension for supper, and aggravation for sleep. Your vacations are the 2 minutes you're not looking over your shoulder for some hood to put one in the back of your head. Your bonuses are maybe 5 minutes when you're not figuring out how to kill someone or keep from getting killed. If you live 6 months, it'll be amazing. If you live a year, it'll be a miracle. That's what we have to offer you. What do you say? Remo said, yeah, sure, you can count on me. Now that rules,
yeah,
right?
That's awesome.
And then they took like 2 lines of that and just like McCleary like quickly says it as they're like walking through an alley, right? But it's like not delivered in the same way. It doesn't have the same like, you know, big operatic feel to it. And that's the thing is like I feel bad for Fred Ward because I think he's pretty good in this. I think he's trying his hardest. Yep. He's giving it his all. He is very fun in this. He's just got that natural Fred Ward charisma. But like you said, everything else about it is so bland. And that goes into, we mentioned Wilford Brimley just giving the most boring performance of all time. Let's talk about, you talk about like misserved actors. The female lead in this is the great Kate Mulgrew. Now, Chris, you know I love Star Trek.
Yes.
So of
And
course
you're going through a little bit of a Star Trek re-phase lately.
Yes.
You've been just eating it all up ever since
Strange New Worlds actually brought that love back. Yeah. And part of that has been I have been revisiting some of Voyager, which of course starred Kate Mulgrew as Captain Catherine Janeway, the first female captain in a Star Trek series. Kate Mulgrew rules. She ruled as Janeway. She ruled on Orange Is the New Black. She ruled in I always say the name of the show wrong. That Paul Scheer comedy Adult Swim show, like NTSF SUV SD.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. She was the commander in that. She was hilarious. Kate Mulgrew just rules as a person in general. If you ever watch an interviews with her, she's just so funny and classy, and she just like represents everything awesome about like badass women. And then in this, she plays like this like nitwit major, Rainer Fleming, obviously named after Ian Fleming would be my assumption. A little nod to Bond there, but she's like she's like a major who starts figuring out that the villain George Grove is like making bad weapons for the government. And she starts like investigating it, and so they kind of like mark her to die, and Remo has to protect her. And you think like there's going to be like some kind of love thing between the two of them, but there's really not. He comes to save her like very late in the game, and then she just kind of always seems like bemused by him and Chun as she sees interactions.
Yeah.
But they play her so dumb and so inconsequential to everything that it really does feel like at some point one of the writers was like, "Oh, we forgot to put a woman in this." And movies and movies need women, right?
Yeah.
So
Totally.
just stick one in there that can be in a few scenes. And it sucks that like that's the female character, and it really sucks that it's Kate Mulgrew, because I know she could be better, right? She could have been like Remo's equal, and they don't even like bother trying that at all. She's not like it's one of two things, right? She either should have been like a sex pot that's fun in the way Bond girls are, or she should have been his equal. Instead, she's just nothing.
And honestly, the movie's better if she's not in it. I know that sounds bad to say because she is such a great actress, and I always like when great actresses any actor gets a great role, but this one is such a fucking wet fart, And because I mentioned earlier that there's the two parallel plots going. It just adds padding. And it keeps Remo away from the villain more. And they're, like you said, there's no meeting of them in the middle. It only happens at the end. It's such a boring plot. Yeah, it's better if she's not in it. And it's just, it's unfortunate. I also wanted to go back a little bit when you were saying about, he's the right man for the job, right? Now, they give really no evidence of this in the entire movie. Like, Fred Ward's he's doing a good job, but I kept second guessing myself of like, why did they pick this guy? He's kind of a buffoon. With his first mission, with quotation fingers, is to enter Chian's house, right? And do something. I don't know exactly what was going on, but he goes in there maybe to assassinate him, something. And he basically just kind of like breaks down the door. He's very clumsy. He knocks things over. He starts fighting Chian, and I know it's supposed to show that Chian's way better at fighting than him, but it's like shot really, really poorly too. So it even just shows that Remo Williams is a moron. So then I just kept sitting back being like, okay, well, I understand that they're doing this now to show him that he's trained later, and now he's great. But he's really bad. Like, he's a bad spy. He's a bad fighter. He's really bad at assassinating people secretly. Why would they pick this guy? And the movie doesn't give any evidence why he's hired.
The first thing we see when he's just the cop, right, is him getting like beat up by some like criminals he accosts in a alleyway, right? So it's like, by removing that backstory of saying he was this like very dangerous, mysterious Vietnam soldier that McCleary remembered, by not including that, you're right. You're getting the movie off to a bad start in that we're just like, that's the guy they picked, and you're not given any reason. Like in the books, it's made clear the whole interesting thing about him is that he already was this like dangerous killer, but he's always been a killer with like a gun, right? And like the whole idea of Remo is that Chian is telling him, we're going to make you the destroyer. You're going to be the next master of Sinaju, which is the martial art, which is a fictional martial art created for the series. He's the current master of Sinaju, and he's going to train Remo Williams to be his like replacement. But that means never using guns, right? You are going to kill everyone through like pressure points and martial arts, and that's the intriguing thing about the books. And they are alluding to that in the movie, but not in any way that like really resonates. So it just doesn't have the same drive, right? You want to see, that's what you want to get to, and he ultimately does kill the spoiler alert. He kills the final bad guy without a gun. Instead, he does it by creating fire with his fingers. but like because the movie like never verbalized it in any way or anything, it doesn't even have the impact it did in the books. You know, so it's just this is really like a misfire on an adaptation level. So for me, like reading the books is probably what really kind of brought it down in my estimation. But I can also just see how it's got some clear problems, even if you're not familiar with the books.
Can I say a couple things that I did like? Let's say that because obviously I'm shitting on it pretty hard, and I think
I think there are things to like in this.
Yeah. So like again, we can't speak enough about Fred Ward. He does a good job. I liked a little bit of especially when it got silly. When it got silly, I was like, okay, I like this. Like, be more silly, please.
Yes.
It's set up early on that Chiun is training Remo to run so fast that he can maybe even like float a little bit off the surface, and it all kind of leads to this payoff of him running across wet cement, which it was hilarious. It was like one of the dumbest like setups and payoffs I've ever seen, but it was extremely goofy, right? And I was like, okay, more of this is fun. There was like acrobatic Dobermans at a certain part.
Dude, the Dobermans, like we were just talking about how like Wilford Brimley kind of sucks in this. The Dobermans are like the best actors in this movie after Fred Ward.
Yeah, they're great. They're great.
They're awesome. Yeah.
I kept thinking like they were also trained by Chiun. Because they start to tightrope walk, and they suddenly magically appear above Remo Williams at a certain point where they were like, how the hell did they get up there?
That whole sequence, right? Like every once in a while, as we said, the movie suddenly turns into what it all should be.
Yeah.
Because you have Remo running away from these like uber smart Dobermans who figure out how to use like a fire escape and pull it down and everything. And he's also at the same time battling like a laser shooting robot, right? It's like, well, where is this in the rest of the movie? Why is this not the movie? Yeah.
I also was impressed by some of the stunts. There's a lot of height stunts.
Yeah.
So in real locations, on the building ledge, on a Ferris wheel, on the Statue of Liberty, hanging off a tree trunk, it really does feel like Fred Ward was there and he was in danger. And I guess Fred Ward's a little bit of an adrenaline junkie, so he wanted to do a majority of his stunts, and they allowed it, which was crazy. But there's a lot of height stunt work, which is good. I also thought it was funny, speaking of the Statue of Liberty fight scene, which is the best part of the movie. It's hilarious that the bad guys give some cash to 3 random construction dudes, and they just immediately become homicidal in broad daylight on their own construction site. So I thought that was really funny. Not a great plan. Yeah, I mean, that's probably really it. I hate to sound so, there is little things here and there. Oh, I like this. I liked Chiun's love of soap operas. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, well, that comes right from the books. And like I said, that's like one of the silly things that they retained. And it's like, see, you should have kept more of that. You should have kept more of the silliness, because that's what we remember ultimately. It's like, we don't remember, plots to cheat the U.S. government out of their military contracts. We remember silly, bizarre character details like Chiun being obsessed with American soap operas. You need more stuff like that. The Statue of Liberty sequence, that's obviously what I was alluding to earlier with, I wonder if, has anyone made that Photoshop yet of like Remo Williams with the 3 Spider-Man on the Statue of Liberty scaffolding? Because it's the same thing, right? It's not just the Statue of Liberty, but it's scaffolding around the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
That's a great example of making the most of your like real surroundings and of the time, right? Because like what happened there is Guy Hamilton realized that at this time the Statue of Liberty actually did have scaffolding all around it, because it was getting kind of like cleaned up and revised a little bit for its centennial. And surprisingly enough, this is like just mind-boggling to me. This movie, Remo Williams, The Adventure Begins, from Orion Pictures, starring Fred Ward, was given permission to actually film on the Statue of Liberty. And that's just incredible. And so some of that is the real Statue of Liberty, and then when they had to do reshoots, some of it is a like kind of a full-sized, well, partly full-sized, a chunk of the Statue of Liberty, like recreation that they built, I think in New Mexico or something like that. Yeah. But that whole sequence is awesome. It's not even that it's the most like high-octane action compared to like what we get today, but it is that I was watching this with my girlfriend. We were talking about how there's just something so different about watching an 80s movie where it's not CGI, right? So when you're seeing those high stunts as you're talking about, it just feels more dangerous. It feels real, and that's what makes it exciting. When Remo is hanging onto a pole that suddenly breaks off and is swinging far out from the scaffolding, it's awesome. I love that stuff. So yeah, that's what I mean. Like, it sucks that that's the middle of the movie, they really should have figured out a way for that to be the climax. They should have retroactively reworked this script to get that to be the end of the movie.
Well, it's weird too because they did have a bigger action set piece planned for the end, but then they ran out of money. So it's again one of the most boring climaxes. You can just tell that the last 30 minutes is just spinning its tires, and it becomes a slog. It really does. I had texted Trev when I found out the runtime, right? And it's like 2 hours and 2 minutes or something like that. And I was like, oh my God, like, what is this about? And then Trev goes, well, there's like 150 novels, haha. And I was like, okay, well, maybe there's going to be some good stuff in it at least. And no, you're right. It peaks at the middle point, and then it's just, you're looking at your watch every 5 minutes. You're like, get me out of this. I just want it to be over. And that's the biggest detriment, is that the movie is just boring. Like, that's just such a big part. It's bland. It's very forgettable outside of the Statue of Liberty and the racism. So, like, there's really, it's again one of those hard ones to talk about. Even though we've been talking about it for over an hour. It's one that nobody will be watching after listening to us.
And also, in addition to the other problems you just had, there's also a moment where Remo, Chun, and Fleming are in a truck that gets blasted off a cliffside, rolls down the cliff, and comes to a crashing stop at the bottom, and it doesn't explode. And the fact that it doesn't explode, I feel like that loses like 2 points right there. You're giving me an A's movie where a vehicle doesn't just instantly explode once it goes off a cliff. Bullshit.
Yeah.
Give me that explosion.
Yeah, 100%.
No, yeah, you're absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think I'm a little bit more positive than you are, but not too much. I would just say, what this movie is for me is this movie fits into that category of like dad movies. You know what I mean? Like this is such a movie that I feel like, for my generation at least, there's these kind of movies that you feel like would always be on like TNT or TBS on like the weekends.
Yep.
And just like a dad would sit there with like a beer and watch them. And Remo Williams has that energy to it. I think of movies like Tombstone and Hunt for October. Now clearly those are like way better than this.
Yeah, I was about to say, hold on a second.
but this fits into that vibe, right? There's just something about it, like this story of like this like heroic blue collar guy.
Right.
And that's what makes this movie maybe doubly frustrating though, because all the pieces are there for it to be much better. You actually have a very fun leading man. Like I said, I do think the relationship between Remo and Chun is fun. And that's why I say my slight defense to it is that I do think it's fun. I think it's legitimately fun for about an hour. I think the first hour is a good movie.
Sure.
The problem is there's a second hour.
Yeah.
And like that's ultimately the failing of this film, is that it overstays its welcome. You were mentioning how no 80s movie should be 2 hours. My counterpoint to that would be like most of the Bond movies are 2 hours or more. The reason Bond gets away with it is the plots are always just so complex and there's so much going on that they fill that time. And that's what Remo Williams forgot to do. It's not filling the time. After the Statue of Liberty point, it's killing time. It's just letting the story drag out to get to that final action set piece, which, as you said, is not impressive enough to wait for. Too much time spent with Kate Mulgrew, which I never thought I'd say, but that's not her fault. She's playing a nothing character. I don't know. I'm like I said, I'm pretty much just in the middle of this one. That really is the worst you can be for a movie, and that's the unfortunate thing. It's just like you watch it and go, huh, and especially to be based off such a crazy book series. I'm not surprised that fans of the books were disappointed in this, and I'm not surprised people who weren't familiar with the books weren't drawn in either. Right? This is kind of one of those movies that, by making some very miscalculated changes, they ended up pleasing nobody. Yep. And that ultimately even speaks to, one last thing, because this is the last note I had. I don't want to forget about this. I mentioned earlier how in the book he's just already Remo Williams, and they never change his name. Having read 3 of the books now, I hated the fact that at the beginning they picked the name Remo Williams because it's printed on a bedpan in his hospital room. Yeah. And I just thought that was such a weird, like, you're like shitting on the character's name, right? You're making like a joke of it being like, haha, it comes from a bedpan. And it's like I'm reminded of how often like comic book movies that don't have like confidence in themselves used to always like make fun of the comic book characters.
Totally.
And that's what it feels like this is doing, right? Like Remo Williams, what kind of name is that? Well, I guess they probably got it off a bedpan. It's like, no, his name was just Remo Williams, and you know what? It's a memorable name. It's fine. Like,
and it's like, again, this super secret, amazing assassin, organization names him after that. So it's like it just feels even grosser, and it feels like they're kind of incompetent. Like it's a big miscalculation overall. And it's funny because this movie obviously bombs. Nobody goes to see it. Nobody wants to see any more of them. But then they try a TV pilot and make the same mistakes that we're talking about, and it never goes to series. Like they cast for Chiun Roddy McDowall.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on here? I think that pilot is available. Like, we could find it. I know me and Trev, when the beginnings of this podcast, we had ideas for spin-offs and stuff, and we did 2 episodes of it, failure to series, and we did failed TV pilots. I don't know if we'll do one with this one.
Chris, not only is the pilot available, I watched it.
Oh yeah, right.
I watched it. I watched it this morning. So you can find it on YouTube. It's you'll find it as Remo Williams' The Prophecy. It's the name of the episode.
Right.
She said it was meant to be the pilot. It is a direct continuation. The opening credits use some stock footage from the movie, so it's clearly from the same people. I know it also comes from. Oh, we didn't even mention this comes from. Oddly enough, the movie and the TV show come from Dick Clark Productions. Like Dick Clark executive produced this, which is also very weird. So the TV show has even more failings though, because it ups the comedy, right? It's trying to be even like goofier, but again, not the right kind of comedy, not like extreme Bond parody comedy, but just like bad cringe attempts at like, lame humor.
Right.
Roddy McDowall, just like Joel Grey, is doing a fine job, I guess. But again, you're just like, oh man, like what?
Again?
But what really sucks is the guy who plays Remo Williams in the show. He's an actor named Jeffrey Meek, and boy, talk about a proper last name, because this guy, I want you to watch at least like 2 minutes of the show at some point, Chris, because you won't believe that any producer thought anybody would buy this guy's Remo Williams. He looks like he's 12. He does not look tough at all. He has there's just nothing about him that says like badass assassin.
Yeah.
He looks like he should be playing like the goofy best friend in like a high school show. He's got like Xander energy. Imagine if like Xander from Buffy was Remo Williams. Like that's it's like so lame. There's this whole sequence where he's on roller skates, and Chiun, to like kind of test him for some reason, also oddly without any explanation, suddenly it's clear they're supposed to be living in like the same apartment from the movie, but it's no longer in New York. Now they're in California, and they go out for a walk, and just to test him, Chiun pushes down a bunch of bikers' motorcycles, but he makes it look like Remo did it, so the bikers will attack him. And it's this like terrible like comedy scene where he's on roller skates fighting these bikers.
Oh my god!
But you're just like watching Remo like trying to get away from these bikers and getting really worried and like fighting back using the roller skates, and it's just like, this is not a badass. This is like a spastic weirdo who's like having to defend himself. It's if you think the movie is like mid, the show is like embarrassing. So it's a good thing it didn't get picked up to series, but that wasn't even like the last attempt, right? They've been trying. So even within the last few years, they talked to Shane Black, who's a big fan of the books, and he was briefly involved, and I don't know what the status of that is, but for a while he was going to write and possibly direct a new Destroyer movie, and he was even talking about maybe getting Fred Decker to help him write it. I don't know. I think
I would say he's a good choice for that. Especially with the peppy dialogue. Like, thinking when you were reading out that section from the book, I was very aware of that, like kind of that 1950s, very hot to trot ways of talking. I was reminded of Rick Moranis from Streets of Fire a little bit. An episode we just recently did, and it's got that cadence to it, and it feels just very peppy. And I love that, and this is what this movie's lacking, and I think that maybe a Shane Black attempt would be there. Shane Black also made The Predator, though, so
I know,
his stock has fallen for me, but
and then you think about who would be like a great like Remo Williams now, because I do think. I think there's a market for this character, right? Handled the right way. Now you have to be a little bit more sensitive about obviously a character like Chiun. This might require a little bit of reconsideration in how you handle it, or not, right? Maybe you go so ridiculous that that's the point. Maybe you like up it to be like, look how ridiculous this character is, and you go even more into self-parody. I'd also be fine with that. I mean, not to be too obvious about it, but maybe we already hit on it. Maybe John Bernthal, right? Maybe John Bernthal's the right guy for this. And honestly, I think I would be down for a Destroyer like Amazon Prime series. You know, they just had some success with that Reacher series.
Totally.
I think that's probably like the right market for this, right? You know, in a world where like Jack Ryan and Reacher have series now, I think that's where these kind of men's adventure like pulp series are kind of falling. And I don't know that the Destroyer could work as a movie franchise, but I think it could be a cool TV show if handled a little more properly.
Yeah.
You know, another thing the movie is missing, I just remembered too, is this is what I think is also funny, and I want to point out, is in the books, Remo Williams is not really described as looking like Fred Ward. In fact, I think he's supposed to be quite a handsome, very like sexy man, more traditionally sexy, because it really does do that Bond thing of like, every woman who meets him is just like, whoa, who's this guy, right? Like they're instantly like turned on. And in fact, in one of the ones I read, number 5, Dr. Quake, we find out that the villains are these two like twin sisters that are like nymphomaniacs who basically
twins, Basil, twins.
Yeah, they like seduce all the men they want to kill, right? And they have sex with them basically like to death. And then they end up having sex with Remo Williams, and the book makes this huge point about how he like tires them out, right? That's like the first time they wake up afterwards and like, what happened? Like, and he's like just, and they're like, oh my God. And then they like, he just was like too much of a man for them.
That's hilarious.
And I was just thinking of like that depiction of him. And then I was like thinking of Fred Ward as like that mentality. Not just like you said, Fred Ward's a handsome man, but the idea of like Fred Ward, no offense to the late great Fred Ward, but I don't know that too many like 20-year-old hot nymphomaniac twins are going like, oh, the guy from Tremors, you know?
But yeah, I mean that'll about do it for Remo Williams. Just kind of a blah movie, and with some very extremely uncomfortable, problematic narrative choices and production choices. So yeah, it was unfortunate because I was, I don't know if I was looking forward. Well, no, I was looking forward to it. What am I talking about? I'm always looking forward to watching what we watch, but. My mentality going into it, I was looking forward to. Like I sat down, I put my phone away to my, my room, and I was like, I really wanted to be in this movie, And very quickly I realized I did not want to be there anymore.
Yeah, it's a rough one. Like ultimately I probably won't recommend it because I'd say, I think if you are a fan of these kind of like, mid-budget, as I said, kind of dad movie, low-stakes action films from the 80s, you'll probably get something out of it. But just know you're probably safe turning it off about halfway through.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
There's some really fun stuff in the first half. I'll keep going back to that. Will I ever put in that DVD again? Especially now that I know it's like a full-frame DVD. Probably not. Right? It's a funny thing to have. Just because it's always going to be funny to me that they made a movie called Remo Williams: The Adventure Begins. Just that level of like confidence and what happened to it. It's cool that Fred Ward got an attempt at a franchise, but yeah, ultimately it's a swing and a miss. This one.
So we are going into our final month of this event. Fall back to the 80s. So the next episode we're going to be looking at is 1987's Masters of the Universe. Yes. I'm looking forward to that one. Then we're going to be watching Shocker from 1989, and that will conclude this 3-month event. Actually, it's been ups and downs and interesting conversations. So definitely go back into your podcast app and check them out. Also, we might have a surprise for you on Halloween. That's all I'm going to say, and I'm really looking forward to that surprise.
Yeah, me too. I'm very excited.
So follow us on all the socials at F2F Pod. That's at F2, the number 2F Pod. Like us there, like us everywhere. Also, rate, review, whatever you do. A star rating, a review on whatever podcast app you're using. It would be great. Also, just join the tribe, hit that subscribe. Check out the podcast app as well. There's a bunch of links to all the socials and even our letterboxd. So, if you want to hear us more or... maybe avoid us, and ways to block us.
If you want to read Chris's very short reviews on Letterboxd and my very long reviews, they're available for you.
So, follow along. This has been a great event, and I'm looking forward to the final month, for sure.
Yeah. Chris, one last question.
Yeah.
Which did you like more, Remo Williams or Streets of Fire?
That's very tough. Yeah. I'll get back to you.
Okay. This is number 32, Killer Chromosomes. What happens when a lady scientist, first of all, already hilarious. What happens when a lady scientist discovers a key to the manipulation of genetic patterns that keeps different species from intermingling? The lady becomes a tiger of the man-eating variety. She is wild, beautiful, and deadly, and she soon decides that she must share her sinister secret with other women. The lovely killer genes multiply geometrically, and so does the fatality rate. The country becomes littered with chewed-up bodies, all men. Enter Remo and Chun, the destroyer, the only weapon against this carnivorous cutie. Handsome Remo, fast on the chase, becomes her prisoner, her love slave. Conspiracy and criminality fall into Remo's usual area of operation. Genetic warfare and animalistic passions are something else again, especially when the enemy looks like a Playboy centerfold. So, as Remo is about to choose between going down in flames or up in smoke, Chun sees a way to preserve the integrity of man's chromosomes and stay alive. Something to do with an ancient Korean proverb about knowing which tail of the tiger to take.
See, like, that's a movie I'd watch.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Like, all these books are fun, man. Like, I'm actually like, if I go back to like more used bookstores and these are cheap, and these were, I'm gonna buy more of these because, like I said, you can read it in a day, and they're just so stupid. And that's the thing is, like, they are dumb, but they're hilarious.